imagine a photo. You've got two policemen just looking away, totally indifferent. And right behind them, I mean, right there on the street, a man is openly defecating. People are just walking past. Now, picture using that image as a political allegory. For the United States, no less, that gives you a taste of the, well, striking material we're diving into today. We have a set of sources here from Dana Zepps, and they offer this really fascinating and sometimes, frankly, quite jarring analysis of, well, everything. The geopolitical scene, Russia, the war in Ukraine, and a very sharp critique of Western, especially U.S., politics. So our goal in this deep dive, to unpack these sources, get a handle on the author's specific viewpoint, and just lay out his key arguments as he presents them. We're not taking sides here, just exploring the material.
Exactly. And Dana Zepps, the author, his background is actually in physics. He uses this method he calls a black box approach to look at political systems. So he was looking at the outputs, the actions, the leaders, what the systems actually produce to try and figure out what's going on inside. And the sources we have cover quite a span, 2017 right up to 2025. So you can see his thinking develop, especially obviously with the war in Ukraine. And just to reiterate, we're sticking only to what's in these documents. We're exploring his viewpoints as written.
Okay, great. Let's start with his core analysis of where Russia is heading. Back in a 2017 source, he makes this pretty bold claim. He says Russia is on an unavoidable path to self-destruction, and he puts the responsibility firmly on the ruling class. He even points to what he sees as these crucial turning points, 1917, 1999, and then 2013.
Right. And he argues it's not just sort of drifting there. It's being pushed by three key independent processes that are moving really fast. First, there's the growth of the opposition. Now, traditionally, it's been pretty weak in Russia, right? But he observes it growing stronger, uniting. He even mentions specific groups, Parnas, FBK, Artobuz-Jurokukir, finding common ground.
So wait, he sees the opposition itself as a driver of this self-destruction, not just like a reaction to it.
That's the argument, yeah. It's an active force in his analysis. Second point is propaganda. It's meant to stupefy the masses, as he puts it. Especially people getting their news mainly from TV, not online. But here's the twist. He claims it's backfired. It's actually stupefied the rulers.
The rulers, how does that work? They start believing their own stuff.
Precisely. That's his take. They've lost the ability to tell the difference between reality and the fake reality they're pumping out. He uses terms like obscurantism or new rush. He sees it as this new kind of social product that has a real impact, leading them to totally lose touch with what's actually happening. And the third process, it's the regime's own behavior. He argues that having lost the sort of ideological roof of the Soviet Union, their actions are now barbaric. And he clarifies, it's not necessarily a moral judgment from him, but that their actions just lack any guiding logic. They're illogical, unpredictable.
Okay, so you've got this growing opposition, rulers bamboozled by their own spin, and this illogical barbaric behavior. Put that all together, and that's what creates these daily absurdities he talks about, where people in the system try to fix one mess, but just end up creating another one and act like it's normal.
Exactly. That's the picture he paints. And tied into this is his view on the national question in Russia. It's pretty striking. He brings up Lenin's old phrase, EF, prison of nations. But he suggests it's actually become something worse now.
What does that translate to? It sounds rough.
It's very crude. Roughly cattle base or livestock depot. His point is about culture. He defines national culture as identity plus contacts, like a living thing. War, especially internal conflict, breaks those links, kills that cultural life. So for him, real help isn't about ruling nations. It's about helping them repair those connections. The cattle days term implies the current regime just treats these nations as, well, undifferentiated stock, not living cultures.
Wow. Okay. Let's shift a bit. He introduces this very specific term in the 2017 sources, or paktika. He says he prefers it to extremism. Wow.
Yeah, paktika is really central to his 2017 analysis. Comes from the word pact, like an agreement or a law. But paktika, as he defines it, is making a mockery of that agreement. It's like you pretend to agree, you use the law, but you have absolutely no intention of following it. Instead, the whole point is to use that fake agreement as an excuse to be cruel, basically, whenever and however you want, to the other party.
So it's not just breaking a promise, it's like weaponizing the promise itself, using the idea of an agreement to inflict harm.
Exactly that. He even connects it to what he describes as rules from ancient descendants of Genghis Khan. Flattery or mockery to people's faces, ignoring agreements, and then extreme cruelty behind their backs. And he argues the Russian rulers use this praktika playbook both internationally and at home. He uses really strong language, says they turn laws into legal waste, or even, well, stronger terms than that. And this legal waste is then applied with, quote, unlimited cruelty against the victims of the regime.
That's a really disturbing concept. So the legal system being distorted isn't just inefficiency or corruption in his view. It's a deliberate tactic.
Precisely. He sees it as intentional, a systematic way to destroy the very idea of justice and the judiciary in the country.
Okay, let's move on to another big theme, propaganda, especially from that 2017 source with the rather long title about destroying citizenship.
Right. His take here is also pretty radical. He's saying propaganda isn't just about fooling people with false information. Its real aim is to actively destroy the idea of citizenship itself, the concept of the citizen. He actually brings in ancient Greek terms here. There's polites, the active citizen involved in the city's life, and then idises, the private person only interested in their own stuff. He points out, our word idiot comes from idises, but the original Greek just meant private or passive, not necessarily stupid. He even suggests the Kremlin rulers are kind of modern idises, focused only on themselves.
And he quotes others describing Russian TV too, right? Like Nemtsov's zombie boxes.
Yeah, and Yevgeny Kiselev's chilling comment about how you have to talk to someone who believes Russian TV like you talk to someone who's mentally ill. He uses these to show the perceived effect, and he details how he thinks propaganda destroys citizenship. First, it replaces the real information environment with a completely fake one, deliberately false. Second, it substitutes this kind of distorted political narrative for actual reality. He notes it works best on TV viewers, those without other info sources. But he also suggests the propagandists themselves get caught out by sudden policy shifts from the top, so they have to fall back on a single, unchanging enemy, which he observes has become the U.S. And this leads him to frame this stark choice for Russians. It's either Russia with the FSB, and he uses this really graphic metaphor. It's genotype infected with gonorrhea, meaning deep moral decay, or Russia without the FSB and without that gonorrhea. He argues the propaganda actively tries to replace the ideal citizen, someone like Boris Nemtsov. He suggests with informers, societal dregs, pro-fascist types, petty criminals, but basically everything that degrades the nation's social fabric or genotype.
And he adds maybe the Kremlin doesn't even realize they're doing this. They think they're saving Russia, but they're just saving their palaces. His bottom line is clear. Propaganda is an information war against the Russian citizen, against citizenship itself, against the future Russian state, even against Russian history.
Okay, let's shift now to the more recent sources from 2024 and 2025. The focus sharpens dramatically on the war in Ukraine. He starts with this observation. War wears down the weak. Cowardly stupid. Pretty blunt.
Very blunt, and he applies it immediately. Russia, he says, is already being worn down, heading for destruction in this war, confirming his earlier analysis.
But the really critical question he poses is about the West, the civilized world. Will it prove to be weak, cowardly, and stupid in how it responds, and therefore also get worn down or damaged by the outcome? And his assessment is quite stark. He states the civilized world is showing these signs: weakness and cowardice.
And he gives examples in the 2024 source, doesn't he, of this perceived weakness? He does. He points to Sweden talking about preparing for a future war while the war is happening now. He mentions what he sees as this kind of implied NATO rule. No NATO soldiers should die, even as Ukrainians are dying in huge numbers. And he definitely sees the political infighting in the U.S., the paralysis, as a major symptom of this weakness. Now, from this author's viewpoint, Ukraine's situation is completely existential. He writes that Ukraine is the only country really fighting back adequately against what he calls the monster Russia. So for him, Ukraine has to win. There's no other option. And the only way is to fight and actively degrade Russia's military and economy. That includes hitting Russian oil infrastructure, he argues, regardless of outside pressure. He specifically mentions potential U.S. pressure, suggesting maybe the U.S. is worried about market profits. But for Ukraine, he says, this is life and death. Their actions are driven by necessity, not what others might want.
Which leads us straight into his critique of the U.S. political system in those later sources. He brings back that black box idea we mentioned earlier. He's looking at the outputs of the U.S. system, the leaders it produces, the actions it takes or doesn't take to figure out the health of the system itself.
Exactly. And the outputs he identifies are, well, pretty alarming from his perspective. He highlights the inconsistent aid to Ukraine, the delays, the blockages as a key output. He argues the system produces incapable letters.
Yeah.
He's very critical of both Biden describing him as unclear, weak, physically struggling, and Trump calling him socially dangerous, morally nihilistic, mentioning alleged Russian ties and scandals.
Wow. Yeah. He really doesn't hold back on either of them.
Not at all. And he doesn't just focus on the leaders. He looks at the parties, Democrats and Republicans, as outputs too. He sees them just fighting each other, turning into nests of hatred, he says, instead of finding solutions. And he points to the massive influence of money in elections as another problematic output.
So based on all the 8 issues, the leaders, the parties, the money, what's the diagnosis of the U.S. system?
His conclusion is that the system is fundamentally unstable, deformed. He calls it a simulation of a healthy democracy, one that can't adapt to crises and seems only capable of producing, well, Trumps and Bidens. And crucially, he doesn't pin the blame on just Trump or Biden as individuals. He blames the system itself. He faults the Democrats, for instance, for the 8 blockages and for, in his view, contributing to Biden's perceived state. He faults Republicans for using someone he describes as a mentally ill person, meaning Trump, for political gain, calls it a Pyrrhic victory. He basically finds both parties guilty. He uses the Russian word criminals to describe them.
That is incredibly strong language. Criminals. And this leads him to a really radical proposal, right? Connecting back to his analysis of Russia's ruling party.
Yeah. It does, yeah. He argues that the U.S. two-party system, much like United Russia in his view, is beyond reform. It needs to be completely dismantled, abolished. He suggests replacing it with just simple democratic elections, maybe with independent candidates, local groups, but without the control of these big national parties. His conclusion in these recent sources is pretty stark. The U.S., with its current political setup, has actually become part of the problem for global democratic stability.
And this whole scathing critique, maybe it's best summed up by that image we started with, that photo from Omsk he uses as an allegory.
Absolutely. It's powerful because it's so visceral. Remind us of the scene again as he describes it.
Right. So you have these 2 policemen, the authorities, right? But they're looking away, completely indifferent, and just behind them, plain as day, a man is defecating in the street. And people are just walking by, ignoring it.
And he reads this directly as a political allegory for the U.S. and Russia, those indifferent policemen. That's the U.S. political leadership, in his view. Could be Democrats or Republicans, could be Biden and Trump specifically. They're supposed to maintain order, uphold norms, but they're just ignoring this flagrant violation happening right there. And the man defecating. That's Russia, Putin, openly violating every norm, war crimes, international order, doing it publicly for everyone to see. And the act itself, this public defecation, he sees it as deliberate mockery. Demonstrative nihilism, he calls it. Done with the absolute confidence that the people who should stop it won't.
So the message he's sending with this incredibly crude but unforgettable image, it's about a moral crisis, right? A failure of institutions to even acknowledge, let alone act on what's happening. He's basically accusing Western leaders, especially the U.S., of collaborating with this bare moral aggressor by talking about negotiations or looking the other way instead of acting decisively. It's not that they don't see it, like the policemen, they choose not to see it, or rather not to act. And the moral he draws, if power pretends not to see shame, shame just becomes the new normal. So we've covered a lot of ground here exploring these sources from Danis Zepps. It's a unique perspective, certainly challenging. We've seen his view of Russia heading for self-destruction, his concept of paktika, the idea of propaganda destroying citizenship, Ukraine's lonely fight, and this really, really sharp critique of the U.S. political system as broken, maybe needing to be dismantled, all symbolized by that Omsk photo.
Right, and I think the analysis presented in these sources leaves you, the listener, with a pretty provocative question to think about. If you take the author's black box analysis seriously, that the U.S. system is currently producing these catastrophic outputs, unable to lead effectively or support allies reliably, well, if that analysis holds any water, what does it actually imply for global stability? What are the real consequences if this system, this black box, isn't fundamentally changed, as the author radically suggests? That's something to ponder based on the material we've unpacked today.